Every trade route in the known galaxy bends. Not slightly, not in the small, forgivable ways that real navigation demands, the gentle curves around gravitational fields, the modest detours past debris zones, the sensible arcs that shave days off long journeys by avoiding what cannot be avoided. Those kinds of bends make sense. Those kinds of bends have reasons, and the reasons are written down somewhere, filed in hazard registries, in flight safety logs, and the accumulated procedural knowledge of centuries of interstellar travel. These bends were different. All 2,847 of them curved around the same region of space. Every shipping lane, every diplomatic corridor, every charted path between the inner systems and the outer rim, all of them flexed away from the same coordinates with the quiet, unanimous consistency of living things moving away from fire. No warning flags marked the region on the official charts. No hazard designations, no recorded anomalies, no debris fields, no radiation zones, no gravitational irregularities considered worth noting in any public database. Just a label. Small text tucked into the lower corner of every star chart that covered that part of the galaxy placed there, as if whoever had written it had not particularly wanted to draw attention to the naming of it. 2 words: human territory. In 400 years, nobody had officially asked why. Alara Voss had been asking questions since she was old enough to form them. Her people considered this a minor character flaw, not dangerous, not shameful, simply inconvenient in the way that a persistent draft through an old wall is inconvenient. You notice it, you sigh, you learn to work around it. Her teachers had noted it in their formal assessments. Her parents had attempted with patient resignation to redirect it toward more productive channels. Her superiors at the Galactic Conclave's Earth Division, housed in the lower administrative levels of a broad government building in Washington, D.C., had eventually learned to simply hand her the assignments where curiosity was at least partially useful and hope for the best. She was 26 years old. By the standards of her species, she was barely past the beginning of things. She had pale gray skin and large dark eyes that caught the fluorescent light of her office, the way still water catches light deeply, completely holding more than it seemed to. She had a habit of tilting her head to the left when something did not make sense to her, which meant that in this particular building on this particular planet, her head was tilted to the left a great deal of the time. Her official title was Junior Analytical Aid Earth Division, Galactic Conclave Diplomatic Corps. What this meant in practice was that she carried documents, organized schedules, confirmed meeting rooms, sourced specific mineral water for ambassadors who would drink nothing else, and was expected to be invisible, present enough to be useful, unimportant enough to be ignored. She was good at the useful part. The invisible part gave her more difficulty. It was the 3rd morning of the journey to Varath Station when she first saw the map. The Eternal Promise was a beautiful ship, built 2 centuries ago by the Kith shipwrights as a gesture of galactic unity, long sweeping lines, a hull the color of old bone rooms, decorated in the styles of a dozen different species. It carried ambassadors and their staffs, senior diplomats, junior aides like Alara, who were supposed to be grateful for the passage and quiet about everything else. The annual summit rotated locations each cycle. This year, it was being held at Varath Station, a neutral platform hanging in empty space between 3 different star systems, and the Eternal Promise was making the journey alongside 11 other diplomatic vessels, all of them taking the same long arc through the Eastern Quadrant. Alara had been walking past the navigation room with a stack of briefing folders when she stopped. She stopped because something on the central display through the open doorway caught her eye. A route map, blue lines on dark space, and something about the shape of it snagged in the part of her brain that was always looking for things that did not quite fit. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she stepped inside because that was what she did when something did not fit. She did not touch anything. She only looked. The route on the screen showed the Eternal Promise's current path to Earth Station. It was a long arc sweeping wide through the Eastern Quadrant, adding what the timestamp indicator suggested was 4 days and 7 hours to a journey that could, by any geometric logic, be considerably shorter. She pulled up the navigation interface on the display panel beside the main screen. Not touching the active controls, just reading the database. What she found as she read was a pattern. Every pre-plotted course in the ship's navigation memory, every destination, every previously traveled route, every charted path going back 200 years of the Eternal Promise's operational history curved away from the same region. Without exception. Without variation. She cross-referenced against the direct routes and mapped the deviations. 4 days on this journey, 6 days on the run to the Thessal border stations, 11 days 11 on the long haul between the inner arm relay points. The region they were all avoiding was large. much larger than she had initially registered. It covered dozens of star systems, hundreds of inhabited worlds, an enormous sweep of the galaxy's inner arm. She found the label almost by accident. Small text lower corner of the regional chart placed as if to technically fulfill the requirement of identification, while making absolutely sure it would not be the first thing anyone noticed. Human territory. Alara tilted her head to the left. She was still tilting it when the door behind her opened. Navigator Cassie Wren crossed the room in 3 strides. She was a tall woman by most species standards, angular, efficient with the particular economy of movement that came from decades of working in confined spaces. She had silver markings along the line of her jaw that shifted color slightly in different light, and she moved with the focused speed of someone who had registered exactly what she was walking into before she reached the doorway. She closed the navigation display in 0.3 seconds. Alara counted it afterward, running the moment back in her memory. 0.3 seconds. The silence that followed was long and specific. The kind of silence that carries information. "I was only looking," Alara said. Cassie did not answer immediately. She stood facing the now blank screen, very still, and her expression was the expression of someone who had received difficult news a very long time ago and had since made their peace with carrying it not comfortably but permanently. The kind of expression that does not invite follow-up questions because the person wearing it has already decided that no follow-up question will be answered. "Go back to your duties, Adivas. I didn't change anything. I was curious about go back to your duties." Alara went, but she looked back once from the doorway. Cassie Wren was still standing at the navigation console, still facing the blank screen. Both of her hands were pressed flat against the surface, not gripping, not braced, just pressing, as if she needed to feel something solid beneath her palms. Her eyes were closed. Alara walked back to her stack of briefing folders. The question stayed with her. It always did. Varath Station was everything a neutral platform was supposed to be. Enormous, impersonal, efficient, and deeply uncomfortable in the particular way of spaces designed by committee to offend no one and therefore please no one. It hung between 3 star systems like a compromise that had calcified into architecture. The Great Hall smelled of 17 different species, attempting with varying degrees of success to occupy the same air. Alara moved through it with her datapad and her schedule invisible, in the way junior aides were supposed to be invisible. She confirmed meeting times. She delivered sealed correspondence to 3 different ambassadors. She sourced the specific mineral water from a particular asteroid belt that the Dreth delegation's senior attaché required, which was not stocked in the station's standard provisions, and which required 3 separate conversations with the catering coordinator to locate. She solved this problem. Quietly, without drawing attention to herself, the attaché grunted at her in a way she had learned over 2 cycles to interpret as genuine appreciation. In the evenings when the official sessions ended and the ambassadors retired, Alara sat in the station's public archive terminal and read. She had found in the station's general database a collection of trade route records, not historical documents, not academic papers, just practical, procedurally necessary shipping logs going back 340 years, organized by departure point and filed by the kind of people who found comfort in comprehensive documentation. She read them the way another person might read a mystery novel, looking not at what was recorded, but at the shape of what was not. She found it everywhere, every shipping lane, every commercial corridor, every recorded journey between the major systems of the inner arm, all of them bent around the same region. Some of the bends were modest, a few extra days, a slight arc. Others were dramatic to the point of appearing irrational, adding weeks to journeys that should have taken more than days. Adding fuel costs, adding time, adding the compounded expense of detour upon detour across centuries of galactic commerce. There was no official explanation in any of the documents. The routes simply curved. They had always curved. The records went back 340 years, and the curve was present in all of them, consistent and unquestioned, the way an old scar is consistent. You stop seeing it after a while because it has always been there. She started asking questions. She was always careful about how she asked them. She did not ask the ambassadors who would either not answer or would have her reassigned somewhere quiet and permanent. She asked the other junior aides, the archive clerks, the station maintenance workers she passed in the service corridors. She framed the questions casually, the way she had learned to, as if she were making small talk, as if the answer did not particularly matter to her. Most people said they did not know what she was talking about. Some of them said this in a way that made it clear they knew exactly what she was talking about and had decided not to discuss it. A few of them, the older ones, the ones who had been working in galactic politics long enough for it to have changed the texture of how they moved through the world, went somewhere behind their eyes when the subject came up. A closing off. A withdrawal that was not rude but was absolute. She had seen the same thing in Cassie Wren, standing at the blank navigation screen, and she was beginning to recognize it as a specific kind of response. Not fear of a present thing. The learned reflex of someone who had been taught over a long time not to look directly at something. On the fourth evening, she found Ambassador Dorian Felt in the station's small public garden. The garden was one of the few places on Varath Station that did not feel like an argument between architecture committees. Someone had brought real soil, real plants, living things from a dozen different worlds, and arranged them in a space that was modest enough to be honest about what it was. It smelled strange, deeply, persistently strange in the way that mixed growing things smell when too many different evolutionary histories occupy the same air, but it was a good kind of strangeness. The kind that reminded you the galaxy was large and various and had been alive for a very long time before any of its current inhabitants arrived. Ambassador Felt was sitting on a low bench near a trailing blue plant, watching it move slightly in the recycled air. He was a lean man with the angular precision of the very old and the particular stillness of someone who had spent so long in rooms full of noise that silence had become a physical comfort to him. He was 73 years old. He had been working in galactic diplomacy for longer than Alara had been alive. They sat together for a while without speaking. He was one of those people who did not need to fill silence with words which Alara appreciated more than she could easily explain. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "You can ask," he said, which was not the same as saying he would answer. "Human territory," she said. "And why does everyone go around it?" Felt was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the blue plant near his feet, his hands folded in his lap with the careful precision of someone who had decided where to put them. "How old are you?" he said. 26 cycles. He was quiet again. The plant moved in the recycled air. Something distant in the station's mechanical systems hummed at a frequency just below conscious attention. "When I was young," he said at last, "my grandmother told me a story. She said that once, a very long time ago, the Urans sent a survey ship into that region. A small vessel. A scientific expedition. 7 crew members." Alara waited. "The ship came back," Felt said. "The crew was fine, healthy, unharmed." He paused for a moment, but they would not talk about what they had seen. Any of them. For the rest of their lives, they would not speak about it. They would leave the room if someone brought it up. The captain burned all of his personal logs from that journey. Every entry. All of it. What did they see? Felt picked up the small blue plant from the soil beside him and set it carefully on his knee, looking at it the way you look at something small and manageable when you do not want to look at the larger thing behind it. "No one knows," he said. "And that is the point of the story, I think." He set the plant back down. "You do not go there, Aid Voss. This is not a rule that anyone wrote down, and it is a rule that simply is the same way that you do not put your hand into fire. You do not need a reason on paper. You simply do not do it." "But the crew came back fine," Alara said. Felt stood up slowly with the careful movements of someone whose joints had developed their own opinions about the pace of things. "They came back silent," he said. "That is not the same as fine." He walked out of the garden without looking back. Alara sat alone with the plants and the strange mixed smell of a dozen different worlds, and her head tilted slowly to the left. The last day of the summit began normally. Alara had 3 document deliveries, 2 schedule confirmations, and 1 errand involving a very specific ceremonial tea that the Thessal delegation's senior advisor required, and that had apparently been left on the Eternal Promise by accident. She handled all of these things competently and invisibly the way she handled everything. She was crossing the station's main corridor, a wide, high-ceilinged hall with transparent panels in the roof, showing the stars outside cold and clear and very far away when she heard the commotion. Not a loud commotion, not shouting, not alarms. Something quieter and more unsettling, the sound of a large number of people going very still all at once, in the way that crowds go still when something has happened that none of them know how to respond to yet. She moved toward it. The communications hub was at the far end of the main corridor. By the time she reached it, the space was already crowded, diplomats, aides, station workers, all of them gathered around the central display with the particular quality of a crowd that does not know whether to move closer or further away and has settled for staying exactly where it is. On the main display was a star chart. And on the star chart, crossing a line that every person in that room recognized, was a single moving signal. A ship's beacon. The identification resolved as she read it, the Iron Fate Dreth registration mid-size vessel, Captain Rourke Dolan. She had seen the name in the morning's security briefs, a Raider-class ship, 9 crew. A history of small-scale commercial piracy in the outer systems. Nothing severe enough to bring Conclave enforcement down on him, just enough to keep himself and his crew alive in the complicated economies of the Outer Rim. The Iron Fate's beacon was moving through the outer boundary of human territory. Nobody spoke. Ilara stood at the edge of the gathered crowd and watched the faces around her. She watched Ambassador Edric Hale, the senior KE representative, who was one of the most composed beings she had observed in 2 years of Conclave work. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his jaw very tight, not looking at the screen, but at a fixed point slightly above it, the way people look when they are managing something internal and do not want the management to be visible. She watched 3 species representatives who had not agreed on a single point of policy in 6 days of summit, standing close together, not touching, not speaking, simply close in the instinctive way that living things seek company when the darkness gets heavy. She found Navigator Cassie Wren near the back of the room. The expression on Cassie's face was the same one she had worn 3 days ago at the navigation console. Not the sharp edge of present fear, but something settled and old, the look of someone who has known for a long time that a specific kind of moment would eventually arrive and has been carrying that knowledge ever since. The beacon moved. It crossed deeper into the boundary region. Someone near the front of the crowd, a junior official newer to this than most, said quietly, "Shouldn't we contact them? Shouldn't we try to reach the ship?" The silence that answered him was worse than any spoken response. The beacon moved, and then it disappeared. Between one scan refresh and the next, without drama or transition, it was simply gone. The blank space on the chart where the signal had been was just a blank space on a chart. The room stayed very still for a long time after that. Ilara stood among them and felt something shift inside her. Not fear. She could not quite reach fear yet because she did not know enough to be afraid of the right things. What she felt was more specific and more unsettling than fear, the experience of watching people she had come to respect, people who governed star systems, who had built careers on careful judgment, who were constitutionally not given to panic, standing pressed close together like children in the dark. These were not frightened people by nature. She had spent 2 cycles watching them. Ambassador Edric Hale did not frighten easily. The elder representatives of 3 ancient civilizations did not cluster together out of instinct. They had not become frightened today. They had always been frightened about this one thing, quietly and consistently, and without ever explaining why, and they had simply gotten very good at not showing it. An emergency session was proposed at the far end of the room, a retrieval operation. Senior voices cautious but present, suggesting that 9 lives might be worth a response. The elder ambassadors shut the conversation down in 8 seconds. Not slowly, not through deliberation or debate. In 8 seconds, with a unity that was itself a kind of answer. These were beings who disagreed on nearly everything, who had spent 6 days at a summit, finding common ground on the most minor procedural points. With immense difficulty, they closed the question. No one was going into human territory, not for 9 crew members, not for anyone. Ilara watched Ambassador Edric Hale's face as the conversation ended. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man who had just confirmed something he already knew, and the confirmation brought him no comfort at all. She stood at the edge of the room for a while after the crowd began to disperse. She looked at the blank space on the chart. She thought about 7 urine scientists who had come back silent. She thought about a galaxy of ancient advanced civilizations, all quietly and consistently walking in long arcs around the same piece of space for 400 years without anyone ever writing down a proper reason why. She thought about what Cassie Wren's pressed palms had meant. She thought about what Ambassador Felt's careful deflection had meant. She thought about the elder ambassadors who had just chosen with complete unity and no visible hesitation not to send a rescue. These were not cruel beings. The Conclave records were full of their work, relief programs, peace agreements, the long, difficult, unglamorous labor of keeping 17 species in some workable approximation of coexistence. They were not leaving 9 people to die because they did not care. They were leaving 9 people to die because the alternative was something they considered worse. That told her something. She turned it over carefully, the way she turned all her important thoughts, looking at it from different angles, testing its weight, feeling for the place where it was most true. What could be worse than 9 people dying? What kind of thing created that calculus in beings of genuine good conscience, instantly without deliberation? The answer that held its shape when she examined it was not a comfortable one, something very large, or something very unknown. Or both, and the not knowing was itself the thing that made the choice possible. When you do not know what you are dealing with, and the people who might know have been silent for 400 years, then the safest response is the response that keeps the silence intact. They were not afraid of what was in human territory. They were afraid of what might happen if someone went in and came back able to tell the truth about it. She was 26 years old, junior aide, invisible with a stack of briefing folders and a navigation database. She had no official business accessing, and a question that had been sitting behind her eyes since the morning she walked past an open doorway and stopped. She picked up her datapad. Outside, the transparent panels above the stars were sharp and cold and very, very old. The blank space on the chart was not a warning. She understood that now. It was a door. And doors in Alara's experience existed to be opened not by the people with authority, not by the people with platforms, but by the people who could not stop looking at them until they understood what was on the other side. She tilted her head to the left. She began. The beacon stayed dark for 3 days. 3 days was not a long time in the life of the galaxy. Stars burned for billions of years. Civilizations rose over centuries. Political disputes between species sometimes ran for generations before anyone bothered to resolve them, and even then the resolutions were usually more like exhausted pauses than actual endings. 3 days was barely a breath, a comma in a very long sentence. But in those 3 days, the silence from inside human territory sat over Vareth Station, the way a held breath sits over a room, not comfortable, not neutral, just present, pressing gently on everything, making ordinary things feel slightly provisional. The conclave, which had been in its closing sessions and preparing for departure, quietly extended the summit by 2 days. No official explanation was offered. No announcement was made. The extension simply appeared on the schedule the morning after the beacon disappeared, and everyone on the station understood why, and no one said it out loud. Alara barely slept. She had in those 3 days built something that her superiors would not have been pleased to know about, a network of information that her access as a junior aide had absolutely no official right to provide. She was good at being invisible. She was good at being present in rooms where people forgot she was there. She had been good at both since childhood, and she had spent 2 cycles at the conclave quietly, carefully being useful to people in ways that accumulated into something like trust. Small kindnesses, covered absences, documents located and delivered without being asked for credit. She used all of it now. From 3 separate sources, she confirmed the Iron Fates situation. Engine failure, catastrophic, sudden, the kind that left a crew with no choices and very little time. Rourke Dolan had taken the nearest available route because it was the only available route. 9 people in a broken ship with nowhere else to go. She confirmed that Ambassador Garrow, the Dreth senior representative, had canceled every remaining appointment on his schedule. An aide who had passed him in the corridor described his face in terms Alara recognized a specific kind of stillness that meant something internal had gone very quiet. She confirmed that proposals for a retrieval operation had been raised and shut down 3 separate times in 3 separate venues, always by the same elder representatives, always within seconds, always with that same quality of absolute certainty that required no deliberation. No weighing of options, no visible conflict. Just the immediate unified closure of a question that had already been answered long before it was asked. On the second day, she sat in the common room and watched those elder ambassadors and tried to understand them honestly. Not judge them, understand them. Ambassador Edric Hale had spent 37 years on stabilization programs for post-conflict systems. His record was long and genuinely good. Ambassador Dorian Felt had brokered 4 peace agreements, at least 2 of which had prevented conflicts that would have cost hundreds of thousands of lives. These were not beings of indifference. They were choosing not to send a rescue, choosing it immediately, without apparent difficulty, and the only explanation that held its shape when Alara examined it was that the thing they were choosing against was something they considered categorically worse than 9 deaths. She was still sitting with that when the alert came. The beacon reappeared on the morning of the 3rd day. Alara was in the communications hub when it happened. She had spent her free hours there on the pretense of updating the conclave's travel records, and the station workers had grown accustomed to her presence in the corner with her datapad. She was close enough to see the signal appear on the main display before anyone else reacted. She read the position coordinates and held very still. The Iron Fate had come out on the far side, not where it had entered. It had crossed into human territory through the near boundary, the edge closest to galactic open space, the line every chart marked with the accumulated dread of long habit. It reappeared at the far boundary, the deep interior edge, thousands of light years from the entry point. It had traveled in 72 hours a distance that should have taken 3 weeks. And it was broadcasting, continuously on an open frequency, the transmission looping, which meant Rourke Dolan had been broadcasting since the moment the Iron Fate cleared the far boundary, repeating it without pause, because perhaps saying something over and over was the only way to begin believing it had actually happened. The communications hub filled in under 12 minutes. Every senior diplomat on Varath Station was present or represented, and the transmission was being routed through the main speakers. Alara stood very still in her corner and listened. The voice that came through was rough, carrying the particular cadence of someone who had spent most of their life in outer rim systems where standard conclave language was a second tongue learned from necessity. It was not a panicked voice. It was not broken. It was something more specific and harder to name, the voice of someone who had held a complete and carefully built picture of how the universe worked and had been shown gently, thoroughly, without violence, that the picture was wrong in one very large and very fundamental way. "We went in," Rourke Dolan's voice said. "We had no choice. Drive failure. We needed the closest road. We crossed the line. We knew what we were doing. We accepted it." A pause. "They found us within minutes. Dozens of ships. Nothing like anything I have seen. Very big. They surrounded us completely. We had no weapons that would have mattered, so we did not try. We just waited." The room was completely silent. Alara could hear the ventilation system overhead, the soft mechanical breath of the station keeping its own life going. They hailed us on our frequency. They knew our frequency. They spoke Dreth, not perfectly, but enough. They asked why we had come. We told them drive failure emergency, we needed passage through. We offered everything we had. Cargo credits, the ship itself if they wanted it. A longer pause. They said no. They said they did not want our things. They asked about our drive. What was wrong with it? Our engineer explained. One of their ships came alongside us. A technician came aboard. She fixed the drive in 4 hours. She did not ask for anything. She just fixed it. Alara watched the faces of the people around her. She watched Ambassador Edric Hale standing with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor performing complicated internal arithmetic. She watched Ambassador Garrow, the Dreth representative, who had stopped not speaking and was now standing near the speakers with an expression she could only describe as undone, as if something he had built himself on had just quietly dissolved beneath him, and he was only now registering the absence of the ground. "Then they gave us a route," the voice continued. "A safe route all the way through. They told us which systems to avoid, which lanes were clear. They guided us the whole way. Their ships stayed close but not threatening. When we reached the far boundary, their lead ship hailed us one more time." The voice changed quality slightly. Not breaking, just bending the way metal bends under pressure it was not designed to hold. "The captain of their lead ship. I do not know her rank. I do not know her name," she said. "Travel safely. Next time, send a message first. We would have come to you." The transmission looped back to the beginning and started again. No one spoke for a long time. Alara stood in her corner and thought about warm blankets passed through an airlock. She thought about a technician who fixed an engine without asking for anything in return. She thought about 7 urine scientists who had come back silent, and she thought for the first time clearly and directly about whether those scientists had been silent from terror, or from something that also had no words, but for entirely different reasons. The transmission spread faster than the conclave could contain it, because the conclave did not move as fast as a looping broadcast on an open frequency. Within a standard day, every relay station within range had picked it up. Within 2 days, it was circulating across civilian networks on a dozen worlds. Within 3, it had reached the kind of distribution that made official containment not only impossible but pointless. The galaxy heard it in pieces the way large things always spread, first to the people paying attention, then to their contacts, then outward in expanding rings the way a stone dropped in water sends rings to every edge. Alara tracked it from her terminal at Conclave Central back in Washington, D.C., where the eternal promise had returned after the extended summit finally ended. She read the public boards, the civilian news feeds, the diplomatic dispatches moving through the station's communication system. She built a picture from the pieces. The reactions told her things. On some worlds, disbelief. The story was too clean, too strange. 9 crew members in a broken ship repaired and guided through the most feared region in the galaxy and sent on their way with a polite farewell. It sounded invented. It sounded like the kind of story a frightened species tells itself to feel better in the dark. On other worlds, something more interesting, shame. Retroactive, specific, uncomfortable. If the Iron Fate had been repaired and guided through without incident, then what had 400 years of careful avoidance actually been built on? What had all those extra weeks of travel time added up to? What had the silence cost if the thing at the center of it had been spending the same 400 years fixing engines and handing out blankets? In the conclave chambers, the reaction was controlled on the surface and volatile underneath. Alara sat in on 3 meetings she had not been invited to, using the reliable method of being very still in a corner with a data pad. In those meetings, she heard the language of institutional management information, verification, the importance of calm, the need to avoid drawing conclusions from a single incident. What she did not hear in any of those meetings was the obvious question. If the Iron Fate came out intact, if the crew was fine, if they had been helped, then what had everyone been afraid of? No one asked it. The most powerful diplomats in the galaxy in meeting after meeting, collectively and carefully, did not ask the most obvious question in the room. That more than anything told her the question had an answer, and that the answer was something the people in those rooms already knew and had decided together not to examine in public. She needed the deep archives. The open records had given her the shape of the gaps. She could feel the outline of the thing in the fog, the places where documentation bent and thinned and disappeared. The titles of documents that returned nothing but access denied when opened, the meeting minutes that jumped from one subject to another with no recorded transition. The expedition logs that simply ended mid-journey with a notation reading, classified level 7. The answer was in the sealed records. The documents the elder nations kept behind permissions that a junior conclave aide had absolutely no legitimate access to. She was going to access them anyway. Not as a plan exactly, as an inevitability. The question had been inside her since the navigation room of the Eternal Promise. It had been growing since then, fed by every deflection and every pressed palm and every careful silence, and it was not going to stop growing until she had followed it all the way to the end. The only question was how long the path would take. It took 3 weeks to find Dr. Harriet Grin. Harriet Grin was 83 years old and had spent 30 years in the Conclave's Deep Archive division before her eyesight made extended screen work impossible. She now lived in a small suite on the garden level of Conclave Central, which smelled of dried paper and strong tea, and the warm, particular dustiness of rooms where a great deal of reading had happened over many decades. Her eyes were clouded with age, but sharp in the way that eyes sometimes grow sharper as the body ages around them, as if the faculty of vision had retreated inward and found something more important to look at. She could recall document identification numbers from 30 years ago, with the precision of someone for whom this was not an effort, but simply a different kind of seeing. Alara visited her 3 times, bringing tea each time, framing her questions as academic curiosity. By the 3rd visit, Harriet had stopped pretending she did not know what Alara was actually asking. The level 7 files, she said, setting her cup down with a small, deliberate click. That is what you want. I want to understand the history, Alara said. You want to understand why the history has holes in it, Harriet said. She looked at Alara steadily across the small table. You are not the first person to want that. What happened to the others? Most were reassigned to quiet postings before they got anywhere interesting. A pause. A few who were more persistent and more careful found what they were looking for. And nothing in most cases. They read the records. They understood things better. They carried that understanding quietly for the rest of their careers, because by the time they finished reading, they understood why the records were sealed. Harriet looked at her for a long moment. Do you know what the actual purpose of a sealed archive is? To protect information, Alara said. Sometimes, but more often it is to protect the people who made the decisions recorded in it. From judgment, from accountability. From the questions of people who came later and have the disadvantage of knowing how things turned out. She stood up slowly with the economy of movement of someone who had made peace with the pace her body now required. I am going to give you a document number. I am not going to tell you how to use it because I genuinely do not know whether the access pathways I use still work. I am giving it to you because I am old enough that the worst consequence available to me is a smaller suite. And because I have been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right questions. She wrote the number on a small piece of paper, physical paper, the kind that left no data trail, no digital footprint, no record of having been written or handed to anyone. Read everything she said, not just the records about humans, read the records around them. Read what the elder nations were doing and saying in that period. Context is how you understand a document. A record without context is just facts. With context, it becomes a story. Alara looked at the number in her hand. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Harriet said. Go find out what happened. The access pathway worked, not easily and not quickly. It took 3 more weeks of careful navigation through the archive system, working from 17 different terminals at different times of day, using the document number as a key that unlocked a chain of linked records leading through a dozen classification levels. She was patient. She did not hurry. She did not make mistakes. When she finally reached the core files, she read for 4 days almost without stopping. What she found was not one story. It was hundreds of stories spread across centuries of records from a dozen different worlds and a dozen different languages, all from the same broad era, roughly 800 to 1200 years ago, the Great Expansion period when multiple civilizations had reached the stars within a few generations of each other, and the galaxy had suddenly become a very crowded and very complicated place. And in those records, threading through them like a consistent presence in a long book, one species appeared again and again, not as monsters, not as warriors, not as the terrifying force that centuries of careful silence had implied. Humans appeared in these old records the way a recurring character appears in a long narrative, consistent, recognizable, present at moments of expansion and conflict, and first contact always somewhere in the background, impossible to fully account for. The first complete account she read was a Kith expedition log from 870 years ago. A survey vessel moving through a system they believed was uninhabited had encountered a human ship in orbit around one of the inner planets. The log used clinical, precise language. The Kith of that era distrusted emotional register in official documentation, but the surprise was legible even through the formality. The human ship had hailed them immediately on a Kith frequency in imperfect but functional Kith language. The survey commander noted that the humans seemed entirely unsurprised, as if encountering other species was not a notable event, as if it was simply a thing that happened sometimes when you were out in the galaxy. The exchange had been brief and courteous. The humans had asked about the expedition's purpose. The Kith commander had explained. The humans had provided detailed information about the system resources hazards, orbital mechanics that had taken the Kith survey team weeks to gather independently. They shared it freely without negotiation, without requesting anything in return. At the end of the exchange, the human ship's commander had said something the Kith log recorded verbatim, apparently because the survey commander found it strange enough to write down exactly, "You are going to meet a lot of us in the coming years. Don't be alarmed. Most of us are reasonably well behaved." The Kith commander's personal notes appended to the official log said, "I do not know what to make of them. They seem to find all of this, the distances, the strangeness, the danger, ordinary. As if the universe is simply a place they are comfortable in." Alara sat with that for a long time before moving forward. There were hundreds more. Urine records of a colony world where humans had arrived, found a small urine settlement already established, and simply set up on the other continent without conflict or formal negotiation. Trade had started within a year. One settler's private journal, somehow preserved in the archive, said, "They seem to genuinely enjoy meeting new people, like it is something they look forward to." Vessel records of a border conflict from 800 years ago between two factions, unable to reach agreement in 3 years, resolved in 3 weeks, when a human mediator arrived without invitation, sat down with both sides and produced an agreement that held for 60 years. The mediator had refused payment. She left because she heard about another conflict somewhere else and wanted to help with that one too. Dreth military records, formal and dense in the archival language of that era of early expansion, clashes that had turned violent met by humans, who arrived not as military forces, but as something harder to categorize. They came into the middle of active conflicts and stopped them. Not through superior firepower alone, though the firepower was mentioned with a particular kind of careful respect. Through presence. Through persistent, patient, refusing to leave presence. Through a quality that a Dreth military commander in year 849 had tried to describe and arrived at this: "They do not fight like beings who are afraid to die. They fight like beings who genuinely believe it does not have to come to this and are frustrated that you are making it necessary." Alara read that line 3 times. The picture assembling itself across 4 days of reading was not simple, and it was not entirely comfortable in the way that simple pictures are comfortable. Humanity in that early expansion era had been everywhere, not in the way of conquest or empire, in the relentless, curious, occasionally exhausting way of a species that had found the universe and decided collectively and individually that they wanted to know all of it and help with as much of it as they could reach. They had shown up in places no one expected, inserted themselves into conflicts they had no direct stake in, shared things, technology, food, medical knowledge, navigation data, with an ease that other species had found variously generous, suspicious, and baffling in equal measure. They had also made mistakes. The records were honest about this in the parts that had not been redacted. early contact errors, cultural misunderstandings that turned sharp before anyone understood what was happening, moments of human impatience, or the particular human tendency to believe they could fix things that did not necessarily want fixing. And then approximately 400 years ago, something shifted. The human presence in the records did not end suddenly. It faded. Like a signal moving gradually out of range, first the frontier contacts became less frequent, then the neutral zone encounters, then the chance meetings and the uninvited mediators. Over roughly 50 years, the records of human contact became thin, then sparse, then stopped. In that same 50-year period, the records of what the elder nations were doing were some of the most heavily classified documents in the archive. Most of the direct records were gone, but there were fragments, enough slips in the redactions, enough shape to the absences, enough context from the records surrounding them as Harriet had instructed for Alara to piece together something very close to the truth. The elder nations had met, multiple times at high levels in secured locations. The Kith, the Urin, the Thessal Command, the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the galaxy, had gathered in private and had made decisions. The records of the meetings themselves were largely absent, but the decisions that came out of them were traceable in subsequent policy changes, in how trade routes were mapped, in how exploration licenses were granted, in the quiet, systematic way that certain kinds of contact were discouraged and certain kinds of records were classified. They had decided to let the silence build, not to attack humanity, not to confront them, simply to allow the distance to grow, to quietly discourage contact, to reroute and reclassify, to let the legend develop on its own momentum. Because a legend carefully tended was more powerful and more controllable than anything requiring active maintenance. A story that children were told and never questioned. A rule that became over generations, a rule without a reason, obeyed purely on the accumulated weight of its age, until the people maintaining it had probably by now half forgotten why it had been built. Alara sat back from the terminal. Her eyes ached. She had been reading for nearly 94 hours across 4 days. She understood the shape now. She could see the whole of it. The terror was not something humans had done. It was something the elder nations had built quietly, carefully over generations. Because a galaxy afraid of human territory was a galaxy that did not expect humanity to solve its problems, did not ask humanity to mediate its disputes, did not send its crises across the boundary, or become dependent on a species with an uncontrollable tendency to show up and try to help. The elder nations had not been afraid of humans. They had been afraid of needing humans. A galaxy that needed a single species for its peace, its medicine, its navigation, its conflict resolution. That was a balance of power that no ancient civilization wanted to live inside. And so they had built a wall of silence and let the legend do the rest. Generation after generation of frightened detours and lowered voices, and you do not go there until the original reason was buried so deep that even the people carrying the tradition had forgotten it was a construction. Until the fear was genuine, inherited, real, passed down like a truth, because the people carrying it no longer knew they were carrying a lie. She thought about what that meant. Not abstractly, but concretely in the specific weight of it. Every trade route that had bent unnecessarily for 400 years. Every ship that had added days and weeks to its journey for no reason except a story that nobody had questioned. Every problem in the galaxy's outer systems that had gone unsolved because the beings best equipped to help had been made into monsters in the telling. Every diplomat who had sat in a room and carefully not asked the obvious question, generation after generation, until not asking it felt like wisdom. The elder nations had not been wrong to worry about dependence. That part she understood. A civilization that could not function without another civilization's help was not truly stable, and stability was the thing that kept 17 species in some workable approximation of peace. She could follow the logic of it, even as she recognized what the logic had become over time. What they had not considered, or had considered and dismissed, was that the solution they chose was itself a kind of dependence. A dependence on the silence holding, on the legend staying intact, on every generation of every species continuing to ask no questions and accept the long way around as simply the way things were. That was a fragile foundation. Every fragile foundation eventually found the weight it could not hold. It had found it in a Dreth Raider with a broken drive and nowhere else to go. She sat very still with this knowledge for a long time. She thought about a Dreth crew with a fixed engine and warm blankets. She thought about 900 years of records showing beings who showed up in broken places and tried to help. She thought about Ambassador Felt's careful deflection and Cassie Wren's pressed palms, and the elder ambassadors who had just confirmed through their silence that they already knew what she had just spent 4 days discovering. She thought about what Harriet Gren had said. Context is how you understand a document. She had the context now. She also had a very large problem because knowing something and being able to do anything with it were different things entirely. She was a junior aide. She had no authority, no platform, no standing in any chamber that mattered. She was 26 years old, and she had just spent 4 days reading the most important secret in the galaxy's recent history, and she was sitting alone in an archive room at 2 in the morning with nowhere to take it. She was still sitting with that when her datapad buzzed. She looked at it. Priority routing, the kind used when a message needed to reach a specific person quickly and directly bypassing standard queuing. The sender field that showed unknown origin. The message was addressed to her full name, her station designation, her current terminal location. We have been watching you read our records, Alara Voss. We appreciate the thoroughness. There is a station at the following coordinates. Come when you are ready. We will be there. Below the message was a set of coordinates. She looked them up immediately, cross-referencing her navigation training without hesitation. The boundary edge of human territory. She stared at the message for a long time. Then she looked up at the ceiling of the archive room and thought about what it meant that they had been watching. Not with alarm, was something more like the vertigo of realizing you had been observed, and that the observation had been patient and kind. She thought about Dr. Sloan Aldridge. Sloan was a cartographer mid-level registered under the Conclave's Earth Division mapping program who had mentioned in passing the previous week that she was taking a boundary survey run next month and was short one data assistant because her usual one had taken sick. The route would pass within reachable distance of those coordinates, not close enough to be obvious. Close enough to be possible if she handled the next few weeks carefully and if Sloan was willing. She walked to Sloan's office the next morning and did something she had not planned to do. She told her everything. Not a summary. The full shape of it, the way Harriet Gren had taught her, with context, with the records surrounding it, with the pattern visible, only when you could see all of it at once. She talked for a long time. Sloan sat across from her with the complete focused attention of someone whose entire career was built around caring about accurate information, and she listened without interrupting until Alara was done. When Alara finished, Sloan was quiet for several minutes. Then she said in a voice that was slower and more careful than her usual precision, "My grandmother was a navigator. She had a colleague once who was curious about the boundary region. This colleague asked too many questions and was eventually reassigned to a remote survey post in the outer systems." She looked at her desk. My grandmother always assumed the reassignment was protective, that the colleague had found something dangerous and the reassignment was to keep them safe. She looked up. I am now thinking the reassignment was not to protect the colleague from danger. No, Alara agreed. I do not think it was. Sloan looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through her expression. Sloan controlled the particular quality of anger that comes from understanding rather than reaction, the kind that does not shout because it is too clear-eyed for shouting. Sloan's vessel was registered under the Conclave's Earth Division cartography program, which meant like all division-affiliated vessels operating near boundary zones, it ran standard government communication protocols in the background whenever it was active. Automated log transmissions, procedural record-keeping, the quiet bureaucratic machinery of accountability. Alara had known this and not thought about it. I will take the detour, Sloan said. The coordinates waited on Alara's datapad, patient, unchanged. Whatever was at the boundary had been patient for 400 years. The station appeared on their sensors 2 hours before they reached it. Alara was sitting in the small observation area at the front of Sloan's mapping vessel when the reading came through, and she stayed very still for a moment after she saw it, letting the data resolve fully before she allowed herself to process it. She had been imagining this moment during the long, quiet hours of the journey, during the data entry, work that had given her legitimate reason to be aboard during the evening meals she and Sloan shared in the ship's small galley, during the nights when she lay in the narrow bunk, and the questions rearranged themselves in her mind, looking for a shape that would finally hold still. She had imagined something imposing, something that communicated through its design the weight of what it represented, something built to remind you of the distance between what you were and what it contained, vast, deliberate scale to make a point. What appeared on the sensor display was a station approximately the size of a modest commercial trading post. No elaborate architecture, no sweeping lines or dramatic proportions. Practical design, clean and efficient, with the aesthetic of something built by people who cared about function and had made their peace with form following entirely from it. No visible weapon ports, which either meant there were none or meant they had been designed by people who felt no particular need to display what they possessed. It sat precisely on the boundary line, Not inside human territory, not outside it. Exactly on the line as if it had been placed there with deliberate mathematical care positioned so that anyone approaching from outside could find it and dock without having to cross over. A meeting point that required nothing from the visitor except the willingness to arrive. Two ships were docked at it, both unlike anything in Alara's reference database. Not threateningly unlike, just straightforwardly, quietly unlike in the way that technology looks when it has developed independently for a long time and arrived at solutions that parallel known designs without quite matching them. The station hailed them before they reached standard hailing distance. Alara noted the gap. By conclave communication standards, they were still several minutes outside normal contact range. The station systems had either been tracking their approach for considerably longer than sensors indicated, or their communication technology operated on parameters that made conclave standards look approximate, possibly both. The voice that came through was speaking standard conclave trade language with an accent that was slight and specific. Not the accent of difficulty, but the accent of someone who had learned the language through comprehensive study rather than immersive use. Precise in the places where immersion creates imprecision. Slightly formal where daily use creates shortcuts. Cartography vessel from Earth Division, Washington. Welcome to the boundary. You are expected. Please dock at Bay 2. There is coffee. Sloan looked at Alara across the narrow width of the observation area. There is coffee, she said in the tone of someone confirming they had heard correctly. There is coffee, Alara confirmed. They docked. The inside of the station was warm. Not the engineered warmth of climate systems set to optimal parameters. The particular warmth of a place that had been lived in and cared for over time. The kind that accumulates slowly from many meals prepared, many hours of people simply existing in a space with some degree of comfort and intention, the warmth that a building earns rather than maintains. It smelled of something Alara could not immediately identify, rich, slightly bitter, with a depth that seemed to carry history in it. She learned later that it was coffee, a human beverage with a long and devoted following, which Dr. Bennett Harlow, who met them at the airlock with a tray of cups, had apparently begun preparing the moment their vessel appeared on the station's sensors on the grounds that the timing should be right. Two humans met them at the airlock. Commander Nora Vale was tall by most species standards, with dark brown skin and gray threaded through close-cropped hair, wearing a practical jacket with no insignia that Alara could read. She moved with the economy of someone who had spent a great deal of time in low-gravity environments and had long since stopped noticing the adjustment. Her eyes were dark and direct and looked at Alara with an attention that was not aggressive, not performing anything. It was simply complete, the full, undivided attention of someone genuinely interested in what they were seeing in the specific way of someone who has been waiting a long time to see it. Beside her, Dr. Bennett Harlow was somewhat shorter, with the comfortable posture of someone rarely in a place they did not want to be, managing the tray of cups with the focused care of someone for whom this was genuinely important. Alara Voss, Commander Vale said, "Not a question, I am Commander Nora Vale. This is Dr. Bennett Harlow, who insisted on the coffee and will be quietly disappointed if you do not at least try it." She glanced at Sloan with a brief recalibration of expectation, not displeasure, something more like interest. "We were not expecting to," she said, "but we are glad you brought someone. It is better to have a witness to what Alara said." Vale looked at her with an expression that Alara could not immediately name. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for a specific kind of moment, had imagined it in many different ways, and was now here in the actual moment of it, finding it different from all the imagined versions. Quieter, smaller, more real. The expression of something enormous arriving without fanfare. The end of a very long misunderstanding, she said. The room they sat in had clearly been arranged for exactly this kind of meeting. A round table. Chairs selected or modified to accommodate proportions that were not human, and attention to detail that said someone had thought carefully about who might eventually arrive. A display wall currently blank. Dr. Harlow distributed coffee with the methodical attention of a ritual performed correctly, and Alara, out of a courtesy she felt genuinely rather than performed, accepted a cup and drank from it. It was extraordinary. She noted this and held the fact carefully that the first thing a human had given her was something beautiful to drink because it felt significant in a way she could not yet fully articulate, but did not want to lose. Commander Vale sat across from her and was quiet for a moment, looking at Alara with that same complete attention, deciding not whether to speak, but where to begin. How to start a story that was very long and needed to be told in a way that would land correctly. Alara decided to help. "I read the archives," she said, "the sealed records. The expansion-era expedition logs from 870 years ago, the Dreth military reports, the Uran colonial journals, the gaps in the elder nation's records from 400 years ago. She paused. I read 94 hours of documents, she said. I know the shape of what happened. I think I need you to tell me whether the shape is right. Vale nodded. We know, she said. We have very good monitoring systems. A pause. We were pleased. Most people who get as far as you did stop when they find the comfortable version, the story that makes the silence understandable without requiring them to question who built it. You kept reading. You knew I was in the archive while I was reading, Alara said. Yes, you could have stopped me. We could have, Vale agreed. We decided not to. You were asking the right questions. She looked at Alara with a steadiness that contained a great deal of time behind it. We have been waiting for quite a long time for someone on the outside to begin asking the right questions. The Iron Fate, Alara said. Captain Rourke Dolan. Was that planned? Something shifted in Vale's expression. A small, specific movement. No. A crew in genuine trouble who needed help. We helped them. She paused. But when it was over, we made a choice. When they cleared the boundary and began broadcasting, we chose not to intercept the transmission. We have always had the ability to manage communications within our boundary. We chose not to use it. We wanted the galaxy to hear what Rourke Dolan said because it would raise questions. Because someone needed to raise questions. She was quiet for a moment. We have been watching the silence hold for 400 years. We have watched it get passed down, maintained, tended, and grow into something that stopped being accurate a very long time ago. We are a patient people, Alara. But patience is not the same as contentment. We have not been content. Sloane, who had been sitting with the focused stillness of someone processing a great deal very carefully, said, Why did you agree to the silence in the first place? Vale looked at her. Something moved through her expression, not quite pain, but the cousin of it. The look of a long memory being carefully accessed. We did not, she said. Not entirely, not the way it became. She chose her words carefully. 400 years ago, there were conversations between human representatives in the elder nations, very high level, very private. The elder nations said essentially that they were concerned about the rate of human expansion, the number of systems we were present in, the influence we were developing simultaneously across multiple regions. She paused. They were not entirely wrong to be concerned. We were everywhere. We were moving fast. Some of us were not always being careful about how we moved. There were real mistakes. We knew that. You agreed to pull back, Alara said. We agreed to a period of self-limitation, Vale said. Voluntary, considered, made in good faith. We thought it would be a few generations' time to consolidate, to develop better protocols for contact and engagement, to be more intentional about what we were doing in the galaxy and how. She looked at the blank display wall. What we did not agree to was the myth. The silence was supposed to be temporary and acknowledged. What the elder nations did afterward was allow the silence to become a story, then they allowed the story to grow. Then they tended it quietly, systematically over generations, rerouting trade lanes, classifying records, ensuring the distances stayed in place not through any confrontation, but through the gradual, persistent architecture of avoidance. By the time we understood how far the story had traveled, 3 centuries had passed. An entire galaxy of species had grown up afraid of a shadow we had no part in creating. And the elder nations who created it were so invested in its maintenance politically, strategically, institutionally, that there was no clean way to dismantle it from the outside without causing the kind of disruption that would itself cause harm. So you waited, Sloane said. We waited for someone to start pulling at the threads from the inside. Vale looked at Alara. We have been waiting for you specifically for approximately 6 months. Since you walked into the navigation room on the Eternal Promise and stood in the doorway staring at the star chart. A strange feeling moved through Alara, the particular vertigo of realizing you had been observed and that the observation had been kind and patient, not predatory. Vale reached into her jacket and placed something on the table. A data chip, small, silver, unremarkable to look at. That contains 400 years of human, scientific, and medical research, she said. Engineering advances, navigation data, agricultural and environmental science, cultural records, philosophy, art. She slid it gently across the table toward Alara. It is a gift, not conditional, not an exchange for anything, not the opening of a negotiation. She met Alara's eyes directly. We have been developing these things in our own space for 400 years because we had nothing better to do with our time. We would like to share them freely with anyone who wants them. Alara looked at the chip, then at Vale. What do you want to happen to the elder nations, she said. The ones still here. The ones still benefiting from what their predecessors built. Vale was quiet for a long moment. That is not our decision to make, she said finally. Whatever accountability looks like, if that is even the right word, and I am genuinely uncertain it is, that belongs to the galaxy to work out, not to us. A pause. We are not coming back to settle old scores. We are not arriving with grievances or demands or a list of what we are owed. She looked at Alara steadily. We are coming back because it has been 400 years and we have things to offer, and we have always been significantly better at being part of things than at standing apart from them. Something shifted in her expression, a warmth that was tired and genuine, simultaneously the warmth of something that had been held for a very long time and was finally being set down. We are going to be very annoying, honestly. We are going to show up in places where people are struggling and offer help that nobody asked for. We are going to learn everyone's languages imperfectly and ask too many questions and have opinions about things that are arguably none of our business. She almost smiled. We have been patient for 400 years. We have a considerable number of opinions saved up. Alara looked at her. She thought about 900 years of records. Mediators who arrived uninvited. Technicians who fixed engines without asking for payment. Beings who walked into active conflicts, believing apparently and sincerely that it did not have to come to this. She thought about warm blankets passed through an airlock in the dark, offered to people who had not asked for them by someone who did not require gratitude in return. She thought about what that impulse looked like from the outside, from inside 300 years of constructed silence, and she understood for the first time why the elder nations had been afraid of it. Not because it was threatening, because it was irresistible. Because a species that showed up uninvited, fixed what was broken, fed what was hungry, mediated what was violent, and asked for nothing in return, was not a species that could be kept at arm's length through normal political means. The only way to maintain distance from something like that was to make it frightening, to build a wall out of silence and let it grow until the wall was real. I think she said slowly that the galaxy is going to find you very surprising. Vale looked at her with the expression that lived in the territory immediately beside a smile. We find that is usually how it goes, she said. Then, you have been leaving your communication channel open since you docked. Alara looked down at her datapad, the automated log transmission. Standard protocol for all Conclave Earth Division affiliated vessels operating near boundary zones. A background function, procedural record keeping, the bureaucratic machinery that ran quietly in the background of every official operation. Sloane's vessel ran it as a matter of course. Alara had activated it before docking out of 2 years of procedural habit, the way you breathe without deciding to breathe. It had been running the entire time. Every word of the conversation, Vale's account of the voluntary withdrawal, the myth the elder nations had built, the 400 years of manufactured silence, the data chip, and what it contained, Vale's description of what humanity intended now had been transmitting in real time to the Conclave Central Relay in Washington, D.C. Alara looked up at Vale. Vale looked back at her with that expression that was not quite a smile, but lived in the territory immediately beside one. The elder nations, she said quietly, are going to have a very interesting afternoon. Outside the station's single observation window, the stars were very bright. On one side of the invisible line, human territory stretched deep and vast and quiet, 400 years of patience and preparation and waiting for the right question. On the other side, Alara could already see on her datapad the first acknowledgement signals returning from the Conclave relay. The first indication that someone at the other end had received what had just been transmitted and understood, at least in part, what they were receiving. She held the data chip in both hands. It was lighter than it should have been for what it contained. The Conclave did not move slowly this time. For an institution that had once spent 11 years debating the correct standard unit of measurement for interstellar distances, the speed of the response was remarkable in its own right. Within 6 hours of the first acknowledgement signals, Alara's datapad was receiving a volume of incoming messages that her notification system could not keep pace with. Within 12 hours, 3 separate emergency sessions had been called in the Conclave chambers in Washington, D.C. Within 24 hours, the conversation that had been quietly and carefully avoided for 400 years was the only conversation happening anywhere in the galaxy. Alara was still at the boundary station when most of this unfolded. Commander Vale had pointed out with calm practicality that being on a small mapping vessel near the boundary was considerably safer right now than being at Conclave Central. Sloane agreed in the measured tones of someone trying very hard to remain calm and largely succeeding. They stayed. Dr. Harlow kept making coffee. Alara was learning always coffee offered not as ceremony, but as a simple ongoing statement about what kind of people these were. She watched the reaction spread from the small screen of her datapad, and it was like watching a stone dropped into water if the water were composed of the political structures of a dozen civilizations and the stone were the truth after a very long absence. The first ring was disbelief, the fastest and the most predictable, burning out quickest. The broadcast had been clear. It was already being replicated across every relay in the galaxy. Disbelief is difficult to maintain when the evidence plays on a loop. People could choose not to believe it, but they could not choose not to have heard it. The second ring was anger, louder, and it lasted considerably longer. Alara read it carefully because the direction of the anger told her something important. It was not directed at humans, not primarily. It was directed inward at the elder nations, at 400 years of manufactured silence, at the accumulated cost of all those routes that were longer than they needed to be. All those problems that went unsolved, all those things that did not happen because the galaxy had been too carefully frightened to cross a line that had been built to be crossed. The KE government issued a statement within 18 hours, carefully worded, qualified. Speaking of the complexity of ancient decisions, the importance of historical context, the need for measured responses to new information. The statement was met with a fury that Alara could feel even through a screen. Other species who had spent generations living around the edges of a fear they had inherited rather than chosen, building their trade routes and their political structures around a silence they had never questioned, were now very ready to talk about it. The third ring was quieter. Alara thought it was the most significant. It came after the noise, after the disbelief and anger had worked through the loudest voices and begun to settle into something more complex. It came from the everyday people, the traders who had spent their careers mapping routes around a boundary they had never questioned. The families who had grown up with the rules so embedded in daily life that it had never occurred to them to wonder about its origin. The teachers who had passed the warning on to 1,000 students without knowing they were passing on a construction rather than a truth. These people were not primarily angry. They were experiencing something harder to name, the feeling of having carried a weight for so long that you had stopped noticing its presence, and then having someone lift it from your shoulders, and for a moment all you could feel was the absence of it. The strange, disorienting lightness of a fear that had just quietly dissolved. Commander Vale watched the reaction alongside her for part of the first day, quiet, her face holding the expression of someone feeling many things simultaneously and experienced enough to let them coexist without forcing them into a simpler shape. "Is it what you expected?" Alara asked at one point. "We modeled many versions of this," Vale said. "The mechanics of how the information would spread, how different species would react, the political implications in the first hours, the first days, the first years." She looked at the screen. The models were accurate more or less about the mechanics. A pause. "They did not capture this, though." She stopped looking for a word. "The relief," Sloane said quietly from across the room. Vale looked at her. "Yes," she said. "The relief." On the second day, the conclave called for an emergency session of all senior representatives. Alara watched the notification arrive and felt the simultaneous awareness that she was being summoned, and that walking back into Washington, D.C. right now would be like stepping into the center of something still finding its shape. She was going anyway. She had not come this far by avoiding things that were still finding their shape. Before she left, she had one final conversation with Commander Vale. She had been carrying a question since the previous day, the most important question, the one she had turned over carefully from every angle before asking it. The things the elder nations did, she said, building the silence, maintaining it across generations. Some of them made this choice knowing exactly what they were doing. They chose it deliberately for political reasons, for strategic reasons, and they passed it down. "Yes," Vale said, "they caused real harm," Alara said. "Not just the fear itself, real harm. Trade routes longer than necessary for 400 years. Resources not shared that could have helped people. Medical knowledge sitting in a data chip for 4 centuries while people died of things it could have treated. Problems unsolved because the galaxy was too afraid to cross a line that was built to be crossed." "Yes," Vale said again in the same even tone. Not defensive, not minimizing, not looking away. "What do you want to happen to them?" Vale was quiet for a long moment. "That is not our decision to make," she said. "Whatever accountability looks like, and I am genuinely uncertain that word is adequate, that belongs to the galaxy to work out. Not to us." A pause. "We are not coming back to settle old scores. We are not arriving with a list of what we are owed." She met Alara's eyes. "We are coming back because it has been 400 years, and we are significantly better at being part of things than at standing apart from them. We have always been better at that." She went back to Washington, D.C., Sloane flew her. They were quiet for most of the journey, carrying their respective thoughts in the comfortable silence of people who had developed genuine mutual respect and did not need to fill it. Conclave Central felt different when she arrived. Not in its physical structure. The corridors were the same. The light was the same. The recycled air was the same. The difference was in the people moving through it. They moved with the particular restlessness of people in the middle of rethinking something large. Conversations everywhere, in doorways in the cafeteria, in small clusters in the wide hallways. Conversations that did not care about their location, because the people having them could not wait. The emergency session was already underway. She did not have standing to attend directly. She went to her small office, sat down, turned on her datapad, and watched the public feed alongside several hundred other conclave staff who were doing the same from their own locations across the station. Ambassador Edric Hale spoke first. Alara had watched this man in sessions many times over 2 cycles. He had always carried a quality of settled certainty, the kind built from long years of authority, and the deep institutional belief that one is fundamentally doing the right thing. Today, he did not have that quality. He looked like a man who was very tired and had decided that the most dignified response available to him was to stop pretending. He did not confess. He did not lay out the history the way Alara had laid it out in the full shape of it. He spoke in the measured language that was his native professional tongue, the formal qualified language of diplomacy, and he could not entirely abandon it even now. But within that language, he said clearly and without qualification that historical decisions had been made regarding human territory that had not been transparent to the wider galactic community, that those decisions had had consequences extending well beyond what had been intended, that the KE government acknowledged this and was prepared to participate in a full and comprehensive review of the historical record. It was not an apology. It was the framework on which an apology could eventually be built, which was perhaps the most that 400 years of institutional habit could produce in a single session, and which was, Alara thought, more than she had expected to see today. The Uran representative followed, then the Thessal delegation, each in their own diplomatic language, each acknowledging in their own careful way the shape of the same truth without quite being willing yet to say it plainly. The session was not a reckoning, not yet. It was the beginning of a process that would take years, difficult years, requiring many more sessions and many more conversations, and a great deal of the painstaking, imperfect work of actual accountability. The kind that does not arrive complete, but has to be built piece by people willing to keep showing up. Alara watched all of it. She took notes. 6 weeks later, the conclave presented her with a formal letter of recognition, signed by representatives of 11 species and entered into the official record. She had expected discipline for the archive access. She had not expected this. It was one of the stranger days of her life. The announcement from human territory came 30 days after the broadcast. Carried on every relay in the galaxy. Not long, 3 paragraphs. Warm and direct, written in language, designed not to impress but to be understood, the kind of language that trusts its audience to receive a simple thing without needing it elaborated. It said that humanity was ready to reopen contact, that they had watched the recent events with interest, and they admitted with relief now that the truth had finally found its way out, that they understood the process of rebuilding trust would be long and had no expectation of it being easy or immediate, that they were prepared to be patient because patience was something they said with dry humor, that was apparently characteristic reasonably good at. It said that the data contained in the chip Commander Vale had given to Alara Voss was freely available to any species that wanted it, with no conditions attached and no expectations of anything in return. It ended with a single sentence. Alara read it the first time alone in her office and let the weight of it settle, turning it over the way she turned all her important thoughts carefully from every angle, feeling for the full shape of it. We have always been better at being neighbors than at being legends, and we would very much like to be neighbors again. She read it the second time to Sloane Aldridge, who was sitting across from her eating lunch and who put down her fork and was quiet for a long moment before saying in her precise and measured voice that it was a very good sentence. She read it the third time to Dr. Harriet Gren, whom she visited that evening in the small suite near the garden level, where it smelled of dried paper and strong tea and the warmth of long reading. Harriet listened with her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap, and when Alara finished, the silence lasted for a long time. "Well," Harriet said at last, "it took long enough." She was smiling, small and tired and entirely real. The smile of someone who had been waiting for the end of a very long story and had finally, at some cost to their patience, heard it. In the months that followed, the galaxy changed, not all at once, not in the sudden, violent way of disasters that remake things quickly and leave rubble. It changed in the slower, more durable way of things that have been understood differently, the way a piece of music changes when you finally understand what the composer was reaching for, or the way an old scar changes when someone finally tells you how it happened and the story is not the one you assumed. Trade routes were remapped, shorter now most of them, the long arcs straightened. Ships that had been making weeks-long detours began plotting direct courses, and the first time a conclave vessel charted a path straight through what had been marked human territory and came out the other side with nothing more eventful to report than a pleasant exchange with a human patrol vessel who had guided them through the busy inner lanes. The pilot's account was read by approximately 4 million people across 12 species in a single day. Human ships began appearing at the edges of galactic space carefully, gradually, in ones and twos. Scientists mostly, merchants, people who had apparently spent a very long time wanting to see the places they had only had maps of for 400 years, and who were now, with a patience that had clearly been hard-won, taking their time doing it properly. They were, as Commander Vale had predicted, with accurate self-knowledge, rather than false modesty, somewhat overwhelming in their enthusiasm. They asked a great many questions. They offered help at a rate that some species found charming and others found exhausting, and most found eventually both at once. They showed up in places that were struggling, as Vial had said they would, and offered assistance that nobody had asked for, and were occasionally annoying about it, and were rarely wrong about where the help was actually needed. There was one detail from Rourke Dolan's formal debrief that stayed with Alara longer than most. It had not been in the original transmission. It was a small thing noted almost as an aside by the debrief officer who had filed the report, as if they were not entirely sure what to make of it and had included it more out of thoroughness than confidence in its significance. During the 4 hours while the human technician was fixing the Iron Fate's drive, other members of the human escort had come alongside in small craft and passed items through the airlock. Food mostly, some medical supplies, a few things that appeared to be comforts, good quality blankets, and a warm, sweet beverage that none of the Dreth crew had tasted before. No one had asked for these things. They had simply been given. When Rourke Dolan's engineer had tried to refuse out of pride or stubbornness or simple disbelief that this was actually happening, the human who handed the boxes through had smiled. Rourke had described the smile in some detail when asked because the debrief officer had noticed he mentioned it twice without being prompted. He said it was the smile of someone who was not surprised by the refusal, who had expected it, who was offering anyway, not because they expected acceptance, but because offering was simply what they did. Alara had read that detail and sat with it for a long time. She had thought about a galaxy that had been afraid of this, of exactly this, for 300 years. The data chip's contents moved through the conclave's science networks. The medical advances alone, 4 centuries of unshared human medical research, produced applications implemented on dozens of worlds within the first year. The number of lives this saved was not a number that was ever properly calculated because it was too large and too distributed to calculate cleanly. But the estimate the science division produced was a number Alara thought about for a long time, turning it over the way she turned all her important thoughts. She thought about Harriet Gren writing a document number on physical paper, trusting that someone would eventually ask the right questions and know what to do with the answer. She thought about Cassie Wren standing at a blank navigation screen with her eyes closed and her palms pressed flat, holding herself steady against something she had never been allowed to name. She thought about Rourke Dolan saying in every interview he gave afterward, "They fixed my drive and gave us blankets. That is all I know, that is all anyone needs to know," and meaning it with the conviction of someone whose entire picture of the universe had been rearranged and who had no intention of going back to the old version. 3 people, 3 different kinds of caring, 3 different ways of living alongside a truth that had no clean place to go. Now it had a place. She thought about the cost of it, the routes and the years and the things that did not happen, and she thought about it the way you think about a scar after it has finally healed with recognition and without the need to press on it anymore. She was sitting in the station's small garden when she thought all of these things. Late in the station's day cycle, most people in their quarters, the recycled air, moving the plants gently, the strange mixed smell of a dozen different worlds drifting around her familiar. Now comfortable in the way that strange things become comfortable when you stop expecting them to resolve into something simpler. Her datapad buzzed. A message from Commander Vale, short as her messages tended to be. "We are opening a permanent liaison station at the inner boundary next month. We would like a conclave representative to be present at the opening, preferably one who asks the right questions. We have good coffee." Interested, Alara read it once. She set the data pad on her knee and looked out through the garden's small, transparent panels at the stars beyond the station hall. Some of them were stars she now knew the names of systems that had been marked human territory on every chart for 3 centuries and were now gradually carefully becoming just places. Stars with planets, planets with people, people who had been patient for a very long time and were at last ready to be neighbors again. She picked up the data pad. She wrote back. One word. Yes, the shortest possible answer to the question. But it was the right answer, and it was the honest one, and it was the beginning of something that would take a very long time and be very complicated and would require at every step the particular kind of courage that is not dramatic or visible. The courage of continuing to ask questions, even when the answers are uncomfortable, of following a shape through the fog all the way to what is actually there, of believing even when it seems unlikely that things can be different from how they have been, and that the difference, when it finally comes, will have been worth the waiting. She sent the message. The plants moved gently in the recycled air. The stars were very bright. She noticed sitting there in the quiet warmth of the garden that her head was perfectly level. For the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she was not tilting it to the left. There was nothing at this particular moment that did not make sense.